What is the believe in God? How does that fit in? What does it mean to believe in God?
Well, okay, so
Lex Fridman asks Jordan Peterson some challenging questions pertaining to Christianity. Let's jump into the video.
a product and had to wrestle with the problem of pricing, you'd become aware of just how intractable that is. Like, how do you calculate worth? Well, there's the central existential problem of life. How do you calculate worth? It's not something like a central authority can sit down and just manage. And there is a lot of inputs that go into a pricing decision. And
I think this is such a good question. Now, in this context, Jordan Peterson is talking about worth of material things or things pertaining to the economy. But if we take this a step farther, how do you calculate the worth of human beings? You see, we get into some problems if we just say we as humans determine a value, because not all humans are the same. We're not all going to agree on what this particular human is worth or this particular human, right? It should be some disagreement. We'll end up with favoritism or partiality, or even this idea that the human species is better than any other. I'm a human, so I would agree with this take, right? That the human species is better. But when it comes to determining the worth of a human being, we need something outside of ourselves, something that's constant, something that's not changing. And I know some of the pushback is going to be, why do we need something outside of ourselves? Why can't we just determine? Yeah, and I get it. I think that's fair to an extent. The question I would pose to those with this pushback is, how do you account for the universe? I think at this point, science has shown us that the universe had a beginning, and the evidence indicates a beginning from nothing. So, not the multiverse or some other theory that presupposes some other created thing, like the vacuum or something. How do you account for all that? If you're going to argue that we don't need something outside of ourselves, that also impacts the way you look at the universe. So how would you account for the universe that we have? I think that's a valid question.
It doesn't.
And that's a form of scaling too.
Right. Well, I mean, whatever ways it breaks down, it doesn't scale.
Yeah.
And you're saying religious thought is a thing that might scale.
I would say religious thought is the record of those ideas that have in fact scaled. Right.
And
Right.
iterated. Well,
iterated.
Does religious thought iterate? So, I mean, there's a fundamental conservative aspect to religious thought.
Yeah.
Tradition.
Yeah. This is why I like Mircea Eliade, for example, who I referred to earlier. One of the things Eliade did, and very effectively, and people like Joseph Campbell, who in some ways were popularizers of Eliade's ideas and Carl Jung's, what they really did was devote themselves to an analysis of those ideas that scaled and iterated across the largest possible spans of time. And so Eliade and Jung, Erich Neumann, they were looking, and Campbell, they were looking at patterns of narrative that were common across religious traditions that had spanned millennia, and found many patterns. The hero's myth, for example, is one of those patterns. And I think the evidence that it has its reflection in human neurophysiology and neuropsychology is incontrovertible. And so these foundational narratives, they last. They're common across multiple religious traditions.
This isn't a popular take, right? Especially in a world that has become so secularized. For him to say that religious thought is the record of those ideas that have scaled, not a popular take. But when you look at the evidence, this is indeed true. No other religion has impacted the world and led to more change for good than Christianity. That doesn't mean that everything done in the name of Christ or Christianity was good. We've heard some of the atrocities committed in the name of Christianity. What you don't hear, or what is overlooked, or intentionally brushed under the rug, is how much good Christianity contributed to the world. Now, going back to this idea of calculating human worth, this idea that human beings have innate value stems directly from a Judeo-Christian worldview. This idea of universal human rights was foreign to majority of human civilization. It all changes when Jesus comes onto the scene. This concept of the hero's journey ties in well with what J.R. Tolkien tells C.S. Lewis, when C.S. Lewis is wrestling with this idea of faith. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference, that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth where the others are men's myths.
What is the believe in God, how does that fit in? What does it mean to believe in God?
Well, okay, so in one of the stories that I cover in We Who Wrestle with God, which I've only recently begun to take apart, say in the last 2 years, is the story of Abraham. That's what the Abraham story addresses. And Abraham is the first true individual in the biblical narrative. So you could think about his story as the archetypal story of the developing individual. So you said, well, what's God? Well, in the Abraham story, God is characterized a lot of different ways in the classic religious texts. Like the Bible is actually a compilation of different characterizations of the divine, with the insistence that they reflect an underlying unity. In the story of Abraham, the divine is the call to adventure. So Abraham has the socialist utopia at hand. He's from a wealthy family and he has everything he needs. And he actually doesn't do anything until he's in his 70s. Now, hypothetically, people in those times lived much longer. But a voice comes to Abraham and it tells him something very specific. It says, leave your zone of comfort. Leave your parents, leave your tent, leave your community, leave your tribe, leave your land. Go out into the world. And finally, he caps it off and he says, there's a better element even to it. There's a capstone. You'll do all three of those things in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so the divinity in the Abrahamic story is making a claim. He says, first of all, there's a drive that you should attend to. So the spirit of adventure that calls you out of your zone of comfort. Now, if you attend to that and you make the sacrifices necessary to follow that path, then the following benefits will accrue to you. Your life will be a blessing. Everyone will hold you in high esteem. You'll establish something of permanent value, and you'll do it in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else.
So God is a call to adventure with some constraints.
A call to true adventure.
To true adventure.
True adventure.
Okay. So I wanted to let it roll through here a bit because I feel, as Jordan Peterson is telling the story, he ties in a lot of different pieces that I wanted to try to kind of compile together what I thought tied into the overall message he was trying to convey. Obviously, you can check out the whole video. I think it's very good. So I think Lex asks a really good question here. And Jordan Peterson answers by referencing back to this idea of the hero's journey and how Abraham fits into this. Now, this whole hero's journey was early on in the video. He had the graphic, we had the call to adventure, and 4 other things. I think Jordan Peterson does a good job of explaining how this all fits together. And some of the comments I saw in the video didn't like his explanation, and I mean I understand why they didn't like it. He kind of went on for a little bit, right? I think it's important that we keep in mind that Jordan is a storyteller, and one of his biggest influences when it comes to Christianity is an Orthodox Christian. I don't know a lot about Orthodox Christianity. I don't know too many Orthodox Christians, but the ones I've seen, or heard, they're big proponents of the mystical side of Christianity, which would kind of lean or indicate or point to this idea of storytelling, right? I think about people like Martin Shaw or Jonathan Pageau, right? It's probably 2 of the more popular ones right now. They're big storytellers, great storytellers. So Jordan Peterson is kind of, I would say, taking this approach, and he was probably a great storyteller before then. Now, I love this take here towards the end where he talks about how that his call to adventure is a call to true adventure, right? Fits nicely with what C.S. Lewis describes. He says, the heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date in a particular place, followed by the definable historical consequences. To be truly Christian, we must both assent to the historical fact and also receive the myth, fact though it has become, with the same imaginative embrace which we accord to all myths.
Yeah, and then that's a good observation, because that begs the question, what constitutes the most true adventure? Well, that's not fully fleshed out until, at least from the Christian perspective, let's say, that's not fully fleshed out until the Gospels, because the passion of Christ is you could say, this is the perfectly reasonable way of looking at it, the passion of Christ is the truest adventure of Abraham. That's a terrible thing, because it's a The Passion story is a catastrophic tragedy, although it obviously has its redemptive elements. But one of the things that's implied there is that there's no distinction between the true adventure of life and taking on the pathway of maximal responsibility and burden. And I can't see how that cannot be true. Like, because the counter hypothesis is, well, Lex, the best thing for you to do in your life is to shrink from all challenge and hide, right? To remain infantile, to remain secure, not to ever push yourself beyond your limits, not to take any risks. Well, no one thinks that's true.
So basically, the maximally worthwhile adventure could possibly be highly correlated with the hardest possible available adventure.
The hardest possible available adventure voluntarily undertaken.
I may have gotten a little ahead of myself when talking about how the story of Jesus is the true myth. At least when you look at the chain of events, in the video. But I think this is more or less what Jordan Peterson is saying here. All throughout scripture, we find these glimpses or previews, these snapshots, right? That point us to something greater, or better yet, someone greater who is to come. We see this from the start with Adam. Later, Paul tells us that Jesus is the greater Adam. Jump ahead to Noah and the ark. We later see how Jesus is the way provided for salvation. When we look at Abraham, we see how Jesus is Abraham's promised seed. He is the founder of a new chosen people. All nations are blessed through him. Looking ahead to Moses, we see how Jesus is the prophet that is foretold in Deuteronomy. This happens over and over again throughout scripture. All the other stories or narratives, biblical stories, biblical narratives, pagan stories, pagan narratives, when they have this hint of truth, this glimpse that they're this higher truth that they're pointing to, all of these things find their fulfillment in the one true story, the story of Jesus. The greatest call to adventure, the truest call to adventure, is found in the gospel. And the good news for us is we know how the story ends. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.